May I welcome everybody here. Thank you for joining us on this extremely joyous occasion of celebrating His Holiness's 75th anniversary on his assumption of religious and temporal leadership in Tibet. It was exactly on this day in 1950 that His Holiness assumed the office of the religious and temporal leadership of Tibet. It's been 75 years, but of those 75 years, only 9 years were spent in Tibet, and thereafter the remaining 66 have been spent in exile by him. Before I get on to the discussions, I'd just like to mention two little incidents that some of you may not be familiar with, which happened before he assumed this office and his childhood, which are very interesting, amusing anecdotes, which he refers to in his two autobiographies, Freedom in Exile and later the Voice for the Voiceless. The first was when he was identified or recognized as a Dalai Lama. He was 3 years old. His village was in the northeast of Tibet in Amdo province. And very soon word spread that he had been recognized as the Dalai Lama and that he would soon be moving to Lhasa for his training and upbringing as the Dalai Lama. But the local warlord, Chinese warlord, decided that he must demand a ransom. And then the ransom had to be paid to him. The Chinese government, of course, claims that they paid the ransom. I don't know the truth, but a ransom was paid before His Holiness and his family were brought to the Lhasa and where his upbringing took place. And then, as you all know, when he was still about 15 years old, there was the invasion in October 1950 by China. And there was a big debate as to how should the government continue. There was the regent, and people started demanding that the Dalai Lama should take over and be given the assumed office. But he was still 2 years short of the normal time that the young Dalai Lama would take over. But then people started demanding. There were people streeting on the streets asking for him to take over. So the seniors decided that they would consult the state oracles. So the state oracles were called, and they were dressed in their dresses, and they were supposed to dance. And then one of the oracles, in his dancing in a trance, came and placed the white scarf in His Holiness's lap and said, "The time has come." And that was how it was decided that he must take over. He took over. And then, of course, the rest is, I suppose, events that we all are familiar with. But I will move now to our first speaker. The Sikyong, incidentally, is not yet here. He's on his way back from Dharamshala. He'll join us as soon as he reaches Delhi, traffic permitting. But I'll request Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon to speak his few words. I don't need to introduce him to anybody here. Former National Security Advisor, former Foreign Secretary, and now professor in Ashoka University. The other qualification I think I must mention is that he was in his childhood in Lhasa. His father was posted there. And when His Holiness escaped to India in 1959, one of the people that Government of India sent immediately to reassure the young Dalai Lama that he was in a safe place was his father went down to Assam to meet the Dalai Lama. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for the privilege of speaking at the celebration of the 75th anniversary of His Holiness taking over both religious and secular leadership of Tibet. It's a real privilege because we're really in a year when, in his 90th year, we're celebrating the life of one of the planet's most remarkable beings. And his life, his message is so inspirational, so unique, and yet still universal. I mean, that's the remarkable thing, I think, that is celebrated around the world. We I'm often asked by friends, why India, under all kinds of governments, has consistently not just hosted His Holiness, but also welcomed and received. His Holiness has been here for 66 years, but welcomed and received the Tibetan community. And I always say that we in India are actually privileged to have him and them with us here. Privileged despite the tragic circumstances which actually brought him to us and brought the community. But we're privileged because his wisdom, his teachings, has, I am convinced, made a difference to our lives in India and to social harmony in India itself. It's really quite remarkable what he has stood for. But there are also obviously good practical reasons why. For one thing, we have tried over these 66 years, actually a little more, to ensure the preservation of Tibetan culture, which is one of the great and unique cultures of the world, which constitutes such an important part of the world's civilizational heritage that its loss would be a real tragedy. Secondly, the practice of Tibetan Buddhism must also continue because it has a message of harmony, of compassion, and the comfort that it brings to not just Tibetans but to so many around the world. And that is something truly valuable. The world would be a much poorer place without that. And most important, what would it say about us, about our own humanity, if we had not responded with hospitality when our neighbors needed it? I think that's the key. You look around the world today, and there are too many examples in today's world of leaders of great powers staying silent or even conniving in mass slaughter, in genocide. Is that what we want to be? How could we not do what we did and be true to ourselves? I think that's the real issue for us. So I would argue that what we were able to do and should continue to do, limited as it is by our capability, was and is not just in India's interest, but in the world's interest. But ultimately, the survival, the flourishing of Tibetan culture, identity, religion, and the cause are as a result of the striving of the Tibetan people themselves and the leadership that His Holiness has given them. And the larger-than-life role in the world of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. It is in their hands that their future will be decided. Take, for instance, something that people have been discussing more and more, the question that's often raised of His Holiness's reincarnation. That's something for him to choose and for the Tibetan people to recognize in accordance with their own religious and cultural traditions, long established and well known and free of outside political interference by any state or government. This is not an issue to be decided by power or by international politics. It's a religious issue to be settled by the Tibetans themselves. And I hope that governments understand this and see their role as enabling the Tibetan community to do so, rather than interfering and making it a political football of their own. That we've come so far from the dark days when His Holiness first came to India, or first came to stay in India in 1959, and that we're celebrating his 90th birth year among us is really tribute to His Holiness's remarkable achievement of keeping the Tibetan cause and tradition alive and evolving with the times. His is the personality, the courage, and the strength that has seen his people through some of the hardest trials possible for a people to face and emerge with their culture, religion, and identity intact and recognized throughout the world. And that resilience that they have shown in the second half of the last century and in this one are truly remarkable and in large measure due to His Holiness himself. So while we celebrate His Holiness's 90th year, the 75th year of his assuming the leadership of Tibet, let us wish him many more to come and good health too. And let's also count ourselves fortunate to have been blessed with his presence and guidance, and wish ourselves this fortune in the future too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Professor Jampa Something. He is Associate Professor teaching the history of Indian Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan history at Central University for Tibetan Studies at Varanasi, India. He is a prolific writer on various issues relating to the subject that he teaches. Over to you, Professor.
Dignitaries on the stage and all the dignitaries here, because today we are gathered here to recollect and to commemorate the 75th year of His Holiness assuming the political and spiritual power. So, therefore, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama legacy is great in terms of spiritual field as well as the politics. We Tibetans believe and treat him like as Avalokiteshvar. So I want His Holiness the present Dalai Lama 14th is 14th in the Dalai Lama incarnation lineage. And as we believe him as the incarnation or manifestation of Avalokiteshvar, the present Dalai Lama is the 75th manifestation of Avalokiteshvar. So this is coincidence. So I wanted to just give a very brief overview of the culture tie between India and Tibet. And then the only contribution I think we Tibetans did for the preservation of ancient Indian culture is through the different incarnation lineage of His Holiness. So 75, I said the present Dalai Lama is the 75th manifestation of Avalokiteshvar. So it is interesting. The first 36 incarnations were born in India as a king in India. And according to the scripture, the 35th king, Anandashri, was described as the father of Shantirakshita, who came to Tibet in the 8th century, which means he lived in the 8th century. Then the 36th king, Arshadhara, was also described as the father of Dipamkar Shirijan, who came to Tibet in the 11th century. So most probably he also lived in the 11th century. So first 36 incarnations or manifestations were born in India, and the remaining were born in Tibet. So this is important. Manifestations born in Tibet as popular kings. According to the Tibetan history, there are 41 kings, and out of which 10 kings are the manifestation of Avalokiteshvar. And the most important is Tibetan have the greatest repository of ancient Indian knowledge, literature. We have preserved the about over 5,000 titles or classical texts of Indian literatures, mainly the Buddhist literatures, from the 7th century until 13th century. So we have the largest number of the Indian translation of the Indian literature, but we have not only preserved the literature, it's a translation of the literature itself, but we have preserved the traditional, learning and the teaching system which we received from the Indian masters, start from the period 7th century until 13th century. So these, the ancient Indian literatures and ancient Indian treasures came to Tibet in two phases. The first phase between the period 7th and 9th century. So during this period of time, the ancient Indian treasure or Indian wisdom was brought to Tibet and translated into Tibetan language and nourished and cultured by the Tibetan, mainly 4 kings who are the manifestation of our Lokiteshvara. Just briefly, I would say, we know that Songtsen Khampo, he was the first Tibetan king who sent Tibetan scholars, Tibetan students to India to learn Buddhism and learn the Indian script and language. Based on the Indian script, the Tibetan script and Tibetan grammar, which is still in use till today, was devised on the Indian script and Indian grammatical system. Since then, we have started translating the Buddhist literature into Tibetan and receiving the Indian master to Tibet. After that, and Teshon Tsen, during the reign of Teshon Tsen, if we don't, without the mention of 3 great Indian scholars, the history of Buddhism in Tibet and the culture contact between India and Tibet in the 8th century would be incomplete. Shantarakshita, Padmasambhava, and Kamalashila. With the coming of these 3 great Indian scholars, Buddhism was introduced and Buddhism was flourished in India, in Tibet. So 2 kings. And then the last king is a Tibetan king, is the Tirepachen. With the effort of these kings, who are considered as the manifestations of our Lokiteshvara, one of the 75 in the lineage, they have brought the ancient Indian wisdom in Tibet during the 7th to 9th period. So this is one phase. And the second phase of Indian knowledge system which came to Tibet was from the period 11th to 13th century. So during this, during the first period, the Avalokiteshvara's manifestations were born in Tibet in the form of as a king. So there were 10 kings. And in the second phase of coming the Buddhism to Tibet, the manifestation or avatar of Avalokiteshvara were born as a scholar and practitioner. So there are 15. There are 15 great scholars and practitioner, among whom the first one is the Dromten Khyabé Jungné. Dromten Khyabé Jungné was the disciple of the Dipankar Shri Gyan, who came to Tibet in 11th century. Without coming, if this great Indian scholar had not been to Tibet in the 11th century, the following then Tibet history of Buddhism in Tibet would be very different. So he was the principal disciple of the Dipankar Shri Jana, and he succeeded the teachings of Dipankar Shri Jana and and from the Kadampa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, and he almost revived the Buddhism in Tibet. He revitalized the translation work in Tibet and practice in Tibet. So, starting from him, there were 15 great Tibetan scholars who are in the lineage of our Avalokiteshvar and in the same lineage of Dalai Lama, who have been responsible, who have been the key person in bringing the Indian knowledge system to Tibet. So that, and after that, the successive incarnation lineage of Dalai Lama. The first Dalai Lama and second Dalai Lama. First Dalai Lama was a disciple of the Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. And first and second, these first two incarnations of Dalai Lama, they were the very great scholars, and they flourished the Tsongkhapa's teaching, and especially they wrote commentaries to the Indian philosophical texts written by the Indian scholars. And since then, the study of philosophical study in Tibet has enriched. And then the third Dalai Lama and fourth Dalai Lama's greatest contribution is to disseminate, to propagate the Buddhist teaching and ancient Indian knowledge system outside Tibet, especially to the land of Mongol. In 1578, the third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, and the Altan Khan, the descendant of the northern Yon Mongol, had the priest-pattern relationship first, and the Dalai Lama title was given by the Altan Khan to the Sonam Gyatso. Since then, the successive incarnations of the Dalai Lama, they succeeded this title. So the first phase of Buddhism, and particularly Buddhism to flourish in Mongolia with the effort of third and fourth Dalai Lama. Then the great fifth Dalai Lama, of course you know that fifth Dalai Lama unified the Tibetan political system, and the whole of the Tibet came under the rule of Dalai Lama, and Dalai Lama institution came into existence. During that period of time, Dalai Lama is the only person who can control, or who can dictate, who can listen to him. The Mongols, because Qing dynasty Qing dynasty was established in 1644, and Dalai Lama came into power in 1642. So the young Qing dynasty was not capable of controlling the powerful Mongol populations. So therefore, fifth Dalai Lama was invited by the Qing emperor simply for the reason that he needs his assistant to pacify the Mongol. So fifth Dalai Lama, and then after that, the fifth Dalai Lama institutions continued, and then now the present PRC, they claim the Tibet was an inseparable part from the ancient, I don't know what, it's just useless. It's spaceless, I think. Because today I came from London. We had a 1 week seminar. The seminar was on the issue relating to the Tibetan cultural heritage materials and objects which are preserved in the various museums in the United Kingdom. So there was an issue. Now China is claiming everything, even the air and water, it's all for them. They think that everything on this, even the bird, everything, they think that everything is owned by them. So sometimes they claim the ownership and the provenance of those objects. So I was just invited to tell this actual history, political history of that period, and particularly what was the purpose of young husband coming to Tibet, related, because many of the articles, objects were brought to United Kingdom during that period of the time. So the thing is very simple. Whether Tibet was under the Chinese rule, what they called the inseparable part of China, or Tibet was a sovereign state at that period of time. Simple thing, we have to learn. Since from 1774, that is from the George Bogle's mission to Tibet, the British India's the principal objective or interest was to establish trade with Tibet, trade in Tibet, trade relation. But unfortunately, Tibetans in those days follow the policy of isolation. They don't want to talk to anybody. They don't listen to anybody. They don't allow any person outside Tibet enter into Tibet. So British, what they did, they signed 4 agreements with China. First, in 1876, what is called Chefu Convention. This is Anglo-Chinese Convention. The main body of the convention is concerning with the Burma, but they included one clause regarding Tibet, that is to give the permission and permission to the British expedition to Tibet, either through India to across the Tibet or either China to across the Tibet. That because Tibetan follow isolation policy. They don't talk, listen, and allow anybody to come in. Outside, even in those days, China is shouting, oh, I am the master of Tibet and I can decide anything regarding Tibet. Then British says, okay, if you can decide anything about Tibet, let us go to Tibet. And this convention was signed. Then in 1885, the British expedition led by Macaulay and his team came to the Tibetan border. With a small military escort. Tibetans refused to enter him, and the proposed expedition was postponed. Failure. Okay, the China's authority over Tibet was failed. They could not prove it. Then second, again, in 1886, again another Anglo-China Convention was signed. That was again the main body of the convention is concerning the Burma, but again one clause concerning Tibet was added. Tibetans got very angry, and then 1888 Tibet, British India border confrontation. There was a border confrontation between the Tibet and British. Then again in 1890, because at that time British wanted 2 things to be settled. One, they wanted to settle the boundary between the Sikkim and Tibet. Because Tibetans claim Nathola, the traditional boundary between the Sikkim and Tibet was Nathola. That was a Tibetan claim. And British say, no, it is not Nathola, it is the Chumpi Valley, just on the downside the valley. And another interest the British wanted to is to establish arrangement of British trade in Tibet. So they wanted these 2 things. And they signed one treaty with the Anglo-Chinese Convention in 1890. Then again in 1893, they signed another Anglo-Chinese Convention regarding the arrangement of trade in Tibet. So now here the problem is, did the Tibetans accept it? The terms and conditions of all these 4 conventions? No, Tibetans flatly refused, and finally, in order to settle the boundary between Sikkim and Tibet, and to make arrangement of British trade in Tibet. These are the 2 objectives of the young husband's expedition to Tibet, because they could not get it done through Chinese, through those 4 Anglo-Chinese conventions. So Lord Curzon, finally, he said, the only option to get done is to discuss with the Tibetans directly. But Tibetans were not ready to talk. So therefore, he has to send a military expedition. So therefore, all these things. And finally, the young husband expedition came to Tibet, and they forced the Tibetan to sign the 1904 Anglo-Tibet Convention signed at Lhasa. Through this convention signed between Tibet and Britain, the Britain achieved what they wanted, all those things. The settlement of the border between the Sikkim and Tibet was settled, and arrangement of trade between Tibet and was settled. And since then, the 3 British Indian, and later it was succeeded by the Indian government, 3 trademarks in Tibet is the result of this 1904 consensus. So all this, what it proves? It proves that Chinese has no authority or no influence or no power over Tibetan issues. Tibetans have the sole authority to decide their both domestic and external affair. So this is very clear. So, okay. So with these remarks, and now find the 14th Dalai Lama's greatest contribution or greatest legacy, what I feel is, it was a blessing in disguise in a way that His Holiness and few hundred Tibetan monk scholars escaped out of Tibet in 1959 along with the 80,000 Tibetan refugees. And because of this, the ancient Indian knowledge system, which had been received by the Tibetans since from the 7th century until 13th century, and since then it was nurtured and preserved by the Tibetans, were brought back to their original country. That was, I think, the greatest gift or greatest legacy of His Holiness. And the Tibetans, we all came empty-handed, but only this piece of knowledge which we obtained, which we received from India, could finally return to India. And then by the gracious, generous support of the Indian government and the people of India, it flourished in India, and now it is made available throughout the world. As Dalai Lama himself said, a simple Buddhist monk or a Dalai Lama of Tibet now became a symbol of world peace. This is just because of the Indian knowledge system that had enriched him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for those extremely wise words and for reminding us of the joint heritage that we have of the teachings of the Buddha. I'd like to welcome, of course, Professor Sikyong Penpat Sering, who's just come back from Dharamshala, where there were celebrations today. But before I give the floor to him, I'd like to request Professor Raja Mohan to speak. He's, as everybody knows, a prolific writer. He's an expert in geostrategic affairs, India's foreign policy, geopolitical affairs. He's also a professor at National University of Singapore. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. It's really a privilege to be a part of this panel commemorating the 75th anniversary of His Holiness's assumption of religious and temporal leadership of Tibet. Thank you for inviting me. I'd also seek your indulgence, Chairman. I have to leave at 7:30, so. Now, I think we've already heard the history of the whole issue. We've seen Ambassador Menon talk about the essence of how and why India has been the kind of hosted Dalai Lama for so long, and the reason why India should be proud for what it has done. So what I thought I'll do is really just raise three broad sets of political issues that now emerge as we mark this important moment. One, I think, compared to the 13th Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama had to face extraordinarily difficult circumstances. For the 13th Dalai Lama, the weakening of the Qing Empire provided an opportunity for the breathing of Tibet as an independent society and the room to connect with the world and come into its own terms. But I think the 14th Dalai Lama, just as he took charge, we had the revolution in China, the re-centralization of China, and the assertion of a strong central power within China. China might have been externally weak at that point, but pretty strong internally. And you see the struggle the 14th Dalai Lama had to face in dealing with this new situation. Whether it was the 17-point agreement in 51, or the struggle to retain a measure of autonomy became increasingly hard. And I think that struggle continues. It's really for the Holiness, it's really what was an expansive moment under the 13th Dalai Lama became a big challenge. And I think this is where I think the genius and the extraordinary achievement of the 14th Dalai Lama. What, as Professor pointed out, Tibet's strategy was isolation. And Tibet was not alone. It was Afghanistan, most of the Himalayan kingdoms saw disconnecting from the world was a way of retaining their independent identity and their culture. So isolation was part of a national strategy across much of Inner Asia. But I think as the empires, the new empires, the rising empires began to thunder down into these inner spaces, for many the challenge was how do you deal with the empires that were expanding, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the British Empire. As they converged, the strategy for these communities was preserve your autonomy by isolation. But I think that strategy was not sustainable. And I think probably you could argue under the 13th Dalai Lama and the kind of opportunities that existed, maybe London, Calcutta, you can say Delhi, all had struggled to come to terms with the extraordinary transformation that was unfolding. That is, Great Britain, British India, and independent India all had to deal with a very, very difficult circumstance. And I think the choices that were made at the time, and I think are still with us. And within this difficult circumstance, I think it's a great achievement of the 14th Dalai Lama to keep the Tibetan community together, to preserve its culture, to preserve its identity. So that's one part. I think in the last 75 years, what he's managed to achieve at a time when communist China was really, turning much of the regions into monochromatic societies, that to retain that identity and culture in exile was an extraordinary achievement. And linked to this, I think, is even more. That is I think the 14th Dalai Lama flipped the isolationist strategy into a globalization strategy. That is actually, he became today, over the last 75 years, from what was an inward-oriented Tibetan society, today it's connected to the world in much deeper ways. As part of the strategy to retain its culture and autonomy was to turn outwards, to relate to the rest of the world. And in the process, I think you have actually, today Tibet is global in its way, its consciousness, the awareness of Tibet, and the issues that it has raised, really, it was the contribution of the 14th Dalai Lama to really connect the world, to understand, to relate to that issue. So these two, I think, I would say, were extraordinary achievements. But what I would say now, turn to the second set of issues that are going to be challenges at this point. I would say 2 or 3 major challenges that the Tibetan community faces today. I mean, I think one is the dramatic rise of China. China's internal growth, its effort to Sinicize all religions within China, its push of Chinese capitalism today, rushing into every corner, like all history of capitalism, it is also transforming regions through a centralized structure. And I think that produces a whole new challenges within the repression or other thing continues within China. So therefore, how do you cope with this economic transformation, the cultural transformation, and the Chinese power that is internally being asserted over Tibet? I think that has sharpened the issue. The second, I think, Chinese economic power globally has put pressure on those who support the Tibetan movement for autonomy. We're not talking about independence, we're talking about autonomy. Therefore, Chinese leverage with most countries to reduce, to limit their support for the Tibetan cause. What we saw in the 80s and the 90s that grew across the world, the support or understanding for the Tibetan cause, today Chinese are imposing costs to that support. Therefore, I think all countries have to find their own ways of dealing with this problem. And I think today China is not only internally strong, but it is externally strong. So that I think this makes the challenge of the Tibetan movement today that much more demanding and more complex. Equally, I think there is also the dispersal of the Tibetan population and holding them together, holding on to a centralized idea of Tibetan culture and society. That becomes another daunting challenge. So therefore, I think we really, at a turning point, I'm not even talking about the question of reincarnation, that's a whole set of issues that exist. So I think there is the fundamental question of Chinese power and what it does to the Tibetan question today is far more starker. Therefore, how you cope with it, I think is the real issue going ahead. I'm sure you have. So I would just conclude by saying that I think surviving difficult moments for any movement is the biggest challenge. That you hold on to your essence under difficult circumstances, because circumstances will always change, just as the circumstances today on the Tibet issue are different from what they were in the late 80s. So I think I would say it is being able to hang in there when storm clouds are passing through, so that you are there for another day to be able to realize your core objectives. And I think that is really a big, so therefore challenge. Therefore, holding on at this point to what you have, to the essence of your culture, becomes much more important in order to be able to to deal with the challenges somewhere down the road. I would also say that the dependence on external to deal with the Chinese challenge is getting weaker because China has become stronger. Therefore, I think some way the Tibetan movement will have to link itself with the democratic movements within China. Not easy, because repression is not limited to Tibet, repression is across the board. Therefore, the larger question of the Tibetan issue being dealt with as part of the democratization of China, I think that's a longer issue. So therefore, for the Tibetan movement to work with other groups within China, they're seeking both within exile or within China, not easy. But I think building that larger coalition, it becomes critical I mean, to use the old communist phrase, a united front. The Chinese were very good at it. The Chinese Communist Party was very good at it. I think that new forms of united front will have to be formed by the Tibetans to be able to deal with the transformation. My own view is, for all the strength of China today, there will be sources of brittleness within. And to assume that nothing will change in China. China is never going to be democratic. China is never going to change. It is simply one red emperor after another is going to rule this land. I think that's fundamentally mistaken. So I think looking ahead, let me tell you, I think you have a huge responsibility, and I wish you all success, and for all of you looking ahead. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Menon, for this very interesting perspective into the role of the 14th Dalai Lama, and also, of course, the challenges that you have pointed out. Now, one of the most important and unique contributions of the 14th Dalai Lama has been the promotion of constitutional democracy within the Tibetan community outside. This process he started very slowly, very gently, way back in the 1990s. And then, as you know, in the year 2011, he handed over all his temporal powers to the Central Tibetan Administration. And we have here with us the Sikyong, the president of this Central Tibetan Administration, with us, Mr. Penpat Sering. He's had a very long career in this field. In 1996, he was elected member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. He did 4 terms as in Parliament. He was also Speaker of the Parliament in exile. And then he became Sikyong in 2021. So over to you.
Good evening. I'm sorry I was a little late because I was flying from Dharamsala. Normally we have several flights from Dharamsala, but today there were only 2, one in the morning and one late evening, and just managed to reach here on time. Of course, I missed Shiv Shankar Menonji's talk, which I would have learned a lot from. But I heard half of what Professor Chamasamden said and full of what Sri Raja Mohan said, because we grew up reading Raja Mohan's columns, learning about geopolitics and all that. So it's an honor to be on the same platform with Shiv Shankar Menonji, who was a very highly regarded diplomat, former National Security Advisor, former Secretary of Ministry of External Affairs, Ambassador, and also to be with Ambassador Dilip Sinhaji, who came out with his book, Great Game in Tibet.
Imperial Games.
Great Game in Imperial Tibet. So we have experts who have lived through history. Professor Chamasamden is one of our senior-most historians in the Tibetan exile community. So this morning we celebrated His Holiness' 75th anniversary of assuming the political and temporal leadership way back on November 17, 1950. And this takeover happened at a very, very critical time in Tibetan history, when China had just come up to the Tibetan border, Communist China having taken over parts of East and Northeastern Tibet, came up to Chamdo and invaded Tibet from Chamdo on October 7th onwards, or 6th onwards. And just 1 month, 10 days after that, His Holiness was persuaded to take up on the responsibility, the Spanish spiritual and temporal responsibility. 6 months after that, of course, His Holiness had to come to Yatung or Chomo on the Indian border in case His Holiness had to seek asylum because of China's invasion on the border. And 6 months after that, we were forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement, which talks about, of course, quite a lot of autonomy for Tibet. If you go through the 17-point agreement, it allows for the institution of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama to continue, which says a lot. If China, what China says, that their narrative of history, Tibetan history, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, then there is no reason for China to offer autonomy for Tibetans also. So I heard part of what Professor Chamasamden said, and I don't want to repeat all those things, but to put the facts right, we have accepted history of more than 3,200 years of Tibet. And starting from the first king, Nyati Tsembo, that is 217 BC, up to the 7th and 9th king of Tibet, from between 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. Tibet even went up to China and dethroned the Tang dynasty. They went up to present-day Uzbekistan. So that used to be the extent of Tibetan Empire. And then we derived this, as Professor Shambhasamde said, we derived this Tibetan script from the Gupta Devanagari script. The Tibetan Buddhism came from India, the Nalanda tradition. So culturally, we are much more closer to India than any other country, including China. And then 400 years of disintegration. I was saying, during those periods, our lamas went to India to study Buddhism, and they came back. Many translators, famous translators, starting from Marpa Lozawa, they came back to Tibet and again brought vibrancy to Buddhism inside Tibet. Even at the end of the 400 years of disintegration, this is not something that is not much talked about. Even Bhaktiar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet from Southeast India, into Tibet, and only 100 returned back. So that shows for the resilience of the Tibetan people at the border, even at the end of the 400 years of disintegration. And then we, of course, developed relations with the Mongols, and our relations with the Mongols went from 13th century to 18th century. We had more to do with the Mongols than with the Chinese. So when the Mongols invaded China, we already developed our relations with the Mongols, and it became the Yuan dynasty in China, whereas Mongols were there even before the Yuan and after the Yuan. So our relations with Mongols goes back many, many centuries. And then Mongols were overthrown by the Mings, from the 1368 to 1644, for almost 300 years, but we had hardly any relations with the Ming Chinese. Even historians talk about the Ming Empire of those days, but Tibet was never part of Ming Chinese. And Professor Shambhasamde also talked about the 5th Dalai Lama, his assumption of power in 1642, 2 years before the Qing overthrew the Mings in 1644. If you do comparative studies of histories, you will find that Tibetan history has preceded the Qing dynasty. And Qing became powerful between 1735 to 1795 for almost 60 years. Then they also went through what China today calls as 100 years of humiliation, starting from Opium War, and the colonization of China by Western powers. So when China themselves could not control their own population, how can they control the isolationist Tibetans? And then Professor talked about the Shefu Convention, the 85, 90, 93 conventions, then coming up to the 1904 invasion of Tibet by British India. He also mentioned the purposes of why it happened. I don't want to go into all those details, but here you have the Ambassador Dilip Sinha, who had wrote a whole book on the imperial game in China, or in those days, establishing influences of territories of influence. It was supposed to have ended by 1906, and then we were the one to sign the 1914 Shimla Agreement, which defines the McMahon Line today, whether we accept it or not. Tibet signed it as an independent state. So then again, beginning of last century also, we had invasion from British in central Tibet. We had the warlord Ma Bufang from northeastern Tibet, then Tower Fang from the Qing dynasty coming into Kham. So we were attacked from all sides at the beginning of the new millennium, last millennium. But then Raja Mohanji also mentioned about the 13th Dalai Lama and his reiteration of Tibetan independence. But sometimes it's construed more like Tibet became independent only after the reiteration of Declaration of Independence by the 13th Dalai Lama. It's not so. Tibet has always been independent. It has never been directly ruled by any governments, including China. So the taking over of the assumption of political and temporal leadership of Tibet by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on November 17, 1950, when Tibet was an independent state, because according to international law, they say Tibet became part of China after we were forced to sign the 17-point, as the so-called 17-point agreement. So I would highly recommend you to read several books, of course, written by Ambassador Dalip Sena, then former Secretary Nirupama Rao, Fractured Himalayas. Then I would also highly recommend you read this Tibet Brief 2020. In the Indian version is Tibet Explained, written by Michael von Bald van Praag and his partner Meek Boltius. They looked at Tibetan history from the traditional definition of sovereignty in the region and also post-modern nation state definition of the state, looks at international law and then proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China through international law. And then I would also recommend another book by a Professor Lo Han Shang, who's based in Las Vegas. He was Chinese, and when he used to go to school, they used to be taught that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Then when he was in his universities in the 60s, then he learned that the Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, is asking every other government to say that Tibet is part of PRC. So as a Chinese, it struck him as to why the Chinese government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of China if Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. So he started studying, he downloaded all the imperial Chinese historical records of the Yuan from 1271 to 1368, to Ming from 1368 to 1644, and Qings from 1644 to 1911. And he proves that imperial China, if you can consider the Yuans who are Mongols and the Manchus, the Qings, as Chinese, then imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. So that history proves, and it's a Chinese professor who's writing, it's not a Tibetan professor. So despite the historical fact of Tibet being an independent state, we don't have a Hanuman like the Indians have to lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere else, wherever we want. So whenever we get to go back to Tibet, we have to live in harmony with Chinese. We lived with Chinese for centuries. Maybe they were not able to climb up the mountains, we were not able to go down the mountains, but we were neighbors. Just like with Nepal or Bhutan or India, different status those days, but we have to, in future also, we have to live in peace with each other. Therefore, His Holiness came out with the middle way policy. So when His Holiness says middle, then there are ends to it. So one end is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, and the other end is the present condition of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. So His Holiness is asking for a middle way. So as Sikyong now leading the Tibetan people on political front, we are, of course, very, very committed to finding a negotiated, mutually beneficial, non-violent solution that could be lasting. Because if you look at all the conflicts around the world, you don't know whether you're resolving one problem or you're creating more problems for future. So His Holiness always appreciated the collective benefit or oneness of humanity, broader humanity, and all that. Since His Holiness appreciates the concept of European Union, because of which His Holiness says that if not for the concept of European Union, Europeans will still be killing each other. So if that can be applied to Europe, then why not Tibet with China as well? And our hope is that if such a solution can come peacefully, then it can bring more peace for the whole subcontinent, not just between China and Tibet, not just between China and India. There has to be broader stability and security issues that could be resolved through trust between the Tibetans and Chinese and Tibetans and the Indians as well. So we decided, we are committed to the middle way, but we decided to change our strategy a little bit by focusing on the ends. If the governments around the world don't recognize the ends, then there's no value for the middle way. Because if every country keeps saying that Tibet is part of the People's Republic of China, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? Because governments say that, oh, we appreciate negotiations between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the representative of the Chinese government, or the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with the Chinese government. At the same time, in the same breath, you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC. Then where's the reason for China to come and talk to us? So to gain leverage for the middle way, so that China comes and talk to us, we worked for 2 years with the U.S. government, with the U.S. Congress, to pass this resolution called the act called the Resolve Tibet Act, which talks about Tibet being an unresolved, yet to be resolved conflict, which talks about Tibetan people's right to self-determination, which is very much in line with the 1961 UN resolution on Tibet. And it also talks about countering China's false narrative on Tibetan history. That China's claims that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, His Holiness does not accept that, and the US government also does not accept China's false narrative, and they will work with like-minded countries to counter China's false narratives. And it also defines the territory of Tibet, because Tibetan people in all the 3 provinces are of one race. We follow the same religion. Politically, there may be ups and downs here and there, but the strength of religious leadership in all of Tibet extends far beyond the political the powers that the local chieftains had. So to understand, it's important to understand Tibet's history from a holistic point of view, not just linking it for the last few decades, because even India has been under subjugation for so long. Every country went through some or other form of colonization. And China's hegemonic ambitions were very, very clear. From the time communists came into power, they started attacking all the neighboring nationalities, as they call it. And today, China's policy is if there are no nationalities, then there will be no nationality issues. So which means, can you kill all the Tibetans to make sure that there are no Tibetan nationalities or the Uyghurs or the Mongolians in the southern side? You can't do that. So what they're doing now is to Sinicize everything in terms of language, which comes from India. Maybe my friend Professor Shamda Samden didn't talk about this. The language that came from India, Tibetan language, today is one among the 15 oldest languages in this world. And we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali text into Tibet from 7th, 8th century to 13th century because before it almost vanished out of. And we are proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian knowledge, which His Holiness talks in the form of his 4th principal commitment. So these, please. So these facts, I think, need to be known. And when more governments accept the historical fact, we are not asking you to lie about Tibet. We are requesting you to accept the reality of the history of Tibet, just like UK changed the policy in 2008 during Cameron's time. Now we need to set the wrong right with the British government also. So you cannot distort history. History was what it was. Even in an individual's life, yesterday was history. In a nation's life also, yesterday was history. You cannot change history just on the whims and fancies of some politicians just because they get better business deals with China. I just want to close by saying, Raja Mohan pointed out about the challenges that we have. We do have a lot of challenges. His Holiness is 90. We just celebrated His Holiness' 90th birthday in July this year. And His Holiness is not going to be younger in the times to come. We know that for a fact. That's why His Holiness has been preparing us from 1960 onwards by introducing democracy and preparing the next generations of leadership, because of which even an ordinary person like me is in this position called Sikyong today. And we have experienced, my predecessor served for 10 years, predecessor to that, Professor Samdang Rinpoche served as elected chief of the cabinet for 10 years. So we already have about 25, 26 years of governing ourselves with the guidance and leadership of His Holiness, but on our own as well, even when His Holiness will no longer be with us in future. So we are looking at different scenarios. We are looking at visibility of our relations with governments from other countries, try to institutionalize those relationships so that that can be maintained even when His Holiness is not with us in future. We are also looking at different scenarios, including status quo of the Chinese government. look at some 7 different scenarios and look at what are the hopes and challenges for Tibetans. So we are looking at everything, every possible way that is at our disposal, because we always have a lot of problems with financial or human resources. Anjali is also here. So we had the US foreign assistance cut, but we managed to get 50% of it, almost 50%. We are still working with the, I just came back from US and Czech Republic after a month-long trip. We had some good meetings, and hopefully things will shape out well. But we'll have to, despite the challenges of dispersing Tibetan community, we are trying to build back and bring some vibrancy into the compact communities, because of which we have been able to preserve our language, our culture, our religion in exile, what has been destroyed inside China, inside Tibet and China. So looking at His Holiness reincarnation also, His Holiness has made it very clear that his lineage will continue, and the Dalai Lama, the contemporary trust of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama will continue, and that trust will be responsible for choosing the next Dalai Lama. China's position is 3. One is that they will look for His Holiness reincarnation within China, and His Holiness' response is very simple: I will be born in a free world. And second, they say, oh, by tradition, Tibetans will have to use the golden urn. My response to this is the golden urn was supposed to have been introduced in 1793 after the first Gorkha War. It was that there were 8 Dalai Lamas before 1793. Does the Chinese government mean to say that the 8 Dalai Lamas before that were not Dalai Lamas? Yeah, so, of course, they say, oh, His Holiness is using this as a political tool. Now, who's really using incarnation as a political tool? It's the Chinese government who is doing it, right? And government that does not believe in any religion now wants to be responsible for recognizing reincarnated lamas in the form of Order number 5, as we back in 2007. So His Holiness' response is, if the Chinese are really serious, they should learn Buddhism first, believe in the concept of life after death. And if the Chinese are really more serious about than that, then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation second. Then even today, even Jiang Zemin is not with us. So His Holiness keeps saying, I'll live for another 2 decades and more. Since this Tibetan New Year, His Holiness said, I'm going to live up to 130 years of age. So I tell that to the Chinese, this message is for you. You're waiting for this Dalai Lama to die. You are not concerned about the living 14, but you are more concerned about the yet to come 15, right? So if there are 2 Dalai Lamas in future, it will be a lifelong headache. They won't be Xi Jinping to resolve that. So do you want a lifelong headache or not? So these are some of the things that we try to counter China with and reach out to the international community as much as we can, because as long as China does not respond positively to the pragmatic approach of His Holiness, we have 2 hands, His Holiness used to say. One goes to the Chinese side, one to the international side. If the Chinese responds to our proposals, then His Holiness will say bye-bye to the international community. So that's how we try to reach out. We have a lot of challenges, but we are not going to lose our hope. We'll keep fighting till the community, I see a lot of young Tibetans here, till we have the next generation of leadership to continue the cause. We will never give up. As His Holiness says, never give up.
All strength to you, sitting on this one. Thank you. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. Would you like to take over?
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of His Holiness Dalai Lama's 90th birthday organizing committee here in New Delhi, I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists here for sharing their expert perspectives on the enduring legacy of His Holiness Dalai Lama, as well as the larger issue of Tibet. I would now like to invite you all to join us for dinner and continue this conversation informally. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Yeah.